Contrast this poem with the one on the Statue of Liberty from many years earlier, "Give me your tired, you're poor." Like the old Bantustans, separating white South Africans physically and ontologically from the African labor on which their existence depended, these new walls I'm suggesting organize such dependency even as they psychically and ideologically articulate separation. It's with this point about the new wall's dissimulation of need and dependency and resurrection of certain gnomic myths about autonomy, desires for purity, containment, and protection that I want to conclude. Mike Davis notes that the new walls resemble dams insofar as they're built to regulate rather than impede flows. But they're like dams in another respect. They are visual signifiers of overwhelming human power and state capacity. As such, they not only recuperate a faltering distinction between us and them, between inside and outside, law and non-law, but distract from the reality of global interdependence with images of autonomy, self-sufficiency, and above all, they dissimulate failing nation-state sovereignty with an image of its rectitude and its might. Walls borrow in this regard from the dimension of sovereignty described by Hobbes as overawing, a dimension of sovereignty likened by Hobbes to God's power, even as walls permit the infiltration they stand for eliminating, and even as they are most often significant as post-nation-state regulators of global flows of people and goods. If as scenes of awe rather than efficacy, image rather than impediment, force rather than might, right, they stage sovereign power in its most theological dress. This reminds us again that waning state sovereignty today decontains the twin powers it was originally established to subdue and contain, religion as well as political economy. We're reminded, too, of the contemporary susceptibility of politics and its subjects to theological motifs, a susceptibility inscribed on the new walls themselves as sovereignty's theological face. This is a part of the barrier in the U.S.-Mexico wall in the desert that is just intended to block vehicles. So we are reminded, too, of the contemporary susceptibility of politics and subjects to theological motifs, a susceptibility inscribed on the new walls themselves as sovereignty's theological face. It's not incidental that the poem we just studied is offered as a prayer addressed to the state. To the extent that the walls optically gratify the wish for intact sovereign power and protection, to the extent that they produce an imago of such power and protection and an effect of sovereign awe, the desire for walling appears as a religiously inflected one. That is, it's a desire that recalls and expresses the theological aspect of political sovereignty. So also is the fantasy of sealing ourselves off from a dangerous outside, often animated, I think, by a yearning to resolve the vulnerability produced by the myriad global forces and flows coursing through nations today. The appeal to the state to provide this resolution thus reconvenes a strong religious version of state sovereignty. The desire for national walling carries, I think, this theological wish, and the wall itself often visually gratifies it. Nation-states organize deflection from crises of national cultural identity, deflection from crises themselves produced by colonial domination in a post-colonial age, or from the discomfort of privilege obtained through superexploitation in an increasingly interconnected and interdependent global economy. Walls confer magical protection against powers incomprehensibly large, corrosive, and humanly uncontrolled. Not only a reckoning with the effects of a nation's own exploits, needs, and aggressions, but also with the nation's dilution by globalization. These theological and psychological features of the clamor for walls helps explain why their often enormous costs and limited efficacy are irrelevant to their desirability by states as well as by the populace. Ancient temples housed gods in an unhorizoned and overwhelming landscape. Nation-state walls, perhaps, are modern-day temples housing the ghosts of political sovereignty. Thank you.
Powerful presentation, and for the images. I mean, I'd read the lecture, but the images just give a real physicality to what you're talking about, so thank you. So I'm sure that you want to come back and ask and debate, but just hold it for a little while. We have two discussants now who, I've got notes about it somewhere. Stuart Elder, on my right, is Professor of Geography at the University of Durham and edits a journal called Society and Space, Environment and Planning D, that we've written many times in our bibliographies, and was also founding editor of a journal called Foucault Studies. His most recent book, Terror and Territory, The Spatial Extent of Sovereignty, was published in 2009. Dr. Rhea Prokovnik is reader in politics at the Open University, homegrown, and is founding editor of a journal, Contemporary Political Theatre. She has two recent books on sovereignty, whose titles I'm going to mangle. The first is called Sovereignties, Contemporary Theory and Practice, 2007, and last year she published Sovereignty, History and Theory. Yeah. So I'm going to ask them to speak in turn, starting with Rhea, and I'm going to be quite strict on time to give you a chance. So hold your questions, write your questions down, and then we'll open it up for a general discussion. Rhea, you going to speak from here?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Wendy Brown has highlighted for us very eloquently and very graphically one of the literally concrete negative effects of the modern state sovereignty conception in the contemporary world. She made a strong case that over recent decades, the nation-state sovereign conception, and in particular its internal capacity, has been compromised by transnational capitalist and religious violence flows. And she outlined for us the contradictions that wall building represents at symbolic and physical levels. Over the next few minutes, I'd like to endorse the target of Wendy Brown's critique, but to come at it from a different point. What I would like to draw attention to is that when we take a historical perspective and look back over the history of the concept of sovereignty, we find a variety of ways in which sovereignty has been conceptualized at different times. For instance, Spinoza's conception in the 17th century, theorizing Dutch practice in the United Provinces in which he lived, emphasizes a polycentric confederal model of sovereignty encompassing the complex autonomy of the different provinces, an identity that did not depend upon permanently fixed territorial boundaries, and a consensual mode of politics. And another example, in the 20th century, Schmitt and Foucault each offered important critiques of some of the problems with the modern state sovereignty conception. It's clear from history and from the history of political thought that conceptions of sovereignty and the effects of sovereignty will at times be contested and are challenged, and so become political. As Schmitt recognised, and his valuable insight into the political stance without the added freight of the friend-enemy distinction, we know that any decision about whether something is unpolitical is always a political decision, irrespective of who decides and what reasons are advanced. By political, Schmitt means that this is the realm of intractability and conflict and of priority over the legal. So given this variation, this multiplicity of conceptions of sovereignty, there are strong grounds for detaching the modern state sovereignty conception from its seeming fusion with the concept itself, and arguing